It started with a routine notice, the kind of paper that most homeowners toss into a pile and forget. The HOA mailed its quarterly statement, the crisp envelope stamped with the community logo, the familiar serif font promising updates and reminders. 4 years the treasurer's reports had been as predictable as the sunrise, dues collected, landscaping contracts paid, a few minor budget adjustments. People paid their fees, maintenance happened, and life moved on. That was the rhythm everyone assumed could be trusted until the rhythm began to skip. At first, the discrepancies were subtle, like the quiet twitch of an eye. A neighbor mentioned a line item in the online portal that looked unfamiliar. A community Facebook post noted a sudden spike in administrative fees. A homeowner who paid late 1 month found an unexplained penalty listed in the ledger. Individually, each small irregularity seemed explainable: clerical errors, timing mismatches, an adjustment for a landscaping invoice. Together, however, the little things began to form a pattern, and patterns in a close-knit neighborhood are hard to ignore. The HOA treasurer, a man who had been trusted by many for his calm demeanor and friendly ways, had been in place for several terms. He was the sort of person who attended neighborhood barbecues, handed out flyers for community events, and whose signature appeared on every check. He carried the institutional trust that often comes with longevity. People tended to assume that someone who showed up so often and smiled so easily must be operating above suspicion. That assumption would prove costly. A small group of homeowners, mostly those who had served on committees and understood the nuts and bolts of HOA finances, began to talk in private messages and late-night texts. They compared notes, traded screenshots, and pulled archived statements. What they found was a tangle of small anomalies: payments labeled vaguely, invoices with missing vendor names, checks written to unfamiliar entities. The sums weren't enormous at first, sometimes a few $100s here, 1,000 there. But as the months stacked up, the missing amounts added up into a number that was anything but minor. The group's initial approach was cautious and administrative. They believed in assuming good faith until proven otherwise. They drafted polite inquiries to the treasurer and requested copies of receipts and invoices for certain line items. They asked for meeting minutes where these payments had been discussed. They approached the problem like reasonable citizens trying to balance a budget: methodical, legal, and careful. The responses they received, however, were slow and oddly defensive. Documents arrived with missing pages or blurred attachments. Explanations were vague, and the treasurer's reassurances contained phrases that did not align with the paperwork. By the time 3 separate homeowners had independently found similar gaps in their accounting, the mood shifted from puzzled to uneasy. The group expanded its review beyond one fiscal quarter, diving into years of records. They sorted spreadsheets, cross-referenced bank statements, and plotted out a timeline of transactions. The more they dug, the clearer a troubling image became. There were checks made out to individuals who did not match vendor lists, direct transfers to private accounts that had no business purpose on the surface, and a pattern of reimbursements that happened repeatedly and without supporting documentation. A sense of betrayal began to settle over the circle. This wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. The patterns suggested intent. Small discrepancies can be innocent, patterns rarely are. The homeowners recognized that their community funds money meant for common area repairs, insurance, and community activities were being diverted. The realization was a bitter one. Trust, once broken, roots itself into suspicion and risk. They were faced with a choice. They could confront the treasurer publicly at the next HOA meeting, an approach that would be loud and possibly humiliating but might force a quick admission. Or they could proceed quietly, collecting incontrovertible evidence before presenting their case. The group, aware of the stakes and the potential legal implications, chose the latter. Panic and accusations could spoil months of work and might even allow the treasurer time to cover tracks. What they needed was documentation that would stand up to scrutiny: canceled checks, bank reconciliations, invoices, and a paper trail that would transform suspicion into proof. As they compiled material, an undercurrent of community gossip began to stir. Small-town barbs spread fast: whispers at the farmer's market, side glances at the mailbox, the cautious smiles of people who knew something that couldn't be said out loud yet. The treasurer, oblivious or defiant, continued to show up at community functions, waving and shaking hands as if nothing had changed. The contrast between his public persona and the private fears circulating among homeowners fueled a growing sense of injustice. People started replaying interactions, wondering how they'd been misled. One homeowner, a retired auditor who had once worked for a county office, took a leading role in the investigation. Her years of experience afforded her a meticulous mind and a healthy skepticism. She began to map the transactions, noting the timing of certain transfers and the recurring names that led nowhere. She traced a network of payments that converged on a handful of entities registered in nearby towns. Some vendors were legitimate, but others were shell-like in nature, PO boxes and obscure LLCs with addresses that pointed to residential streets. The retired auditor's instincts told her the inconsistencies were not random. In parallel, another member of the group reached out informally to a friendly contact at the bank, someone who had provided neighborhood education sessions and understood the basics of nonprofit banking. The bank representative offered to review particular transactions for signs of irregularities, mindful of privacy laws but willing to advise on red flags. Together, they identified several transfers that looked suspicious because the amounts were structured just below thresholds that might trigger internal auditing flags. The pattern of structuring was a tactic often used to evade scrutiny, and that realization deepened the group's resolve. The homeowners took care to ensure that their actions remained within legal bounds. They made copies of all requested documents, printed bank records where permissible, and kept a dated log of their findings. They understood that they were not reaching for vigilante justice, but rather building a case that would demand official attention. The gravity of that responsibility was heavy. They were dealing not simply with misallocated money but with the erosion of communal trust. Tensions in the neighborhood rose as the group quietly prepared for the day of reckoning. They scheduled a special audit request for the next board meeting and considered the legal counsel options that would be necessary if their concerns were validated. In the meantime, the treasurer continued in his role, decorous at meetings, smiling at gatherings, an efficient man who seemed to move seamlessly between comfort and authority. The contrast between his outward calm and the mounting evidence against him lent an almost cinematic quality to the unfolding drama. As the homeowners finalized their dossier, they realized their efforts had already changed the neighborhood in subtle ways. People who once accepted the status quo now checked receipts, asked for explanations, and paid attention to board decisions. The sense of civic vigilance that replaced complacency felt empowering, even as it exposed the fragility of their social fabric. The coming presentation would not be easy. Exposing financial misconduct within a voluntary community organization would send shockwaves. But by the time the group had assembled every shred of paper, calculated every cross-reference, and rehearsed their public accountings, they knew there was no turning back. The question was no longer whether the treasurer had misappropriated funds, but how deep the deception ran and what it meant for a neighborhood that had once assumed trust by default. The next HOA meeting promised to be the moment of truth. The homeowners prepared themselves for the unraveling that their evidence would cause, aware that friendships could fracture and reputations could be ruined. Yet beneath the unease lay a steadfast determination to restore fiscal integrity and reclaim their community coffers. The first red flag had become a banner under which the neighborhood would rally or fall apart trying. The HOA meeting that would become the turning point for the entire community began with an unusual tension in the air. Normally, these gatherings drew only a handful of residents, the same dedicated souls who enjoyed discussing landscaping plans, parking rules, and seasonal decorations. But tonight, folding chairs had to be added. Neighbors who rarely attended sat shoulder to shoulder, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, unease, and simmering suspicion. Whispered conversations fluttered around the room like restless wings, carrying rumors of missing money and financial misconduct that had finally become impossible to ignore. The treasurer, seated at the center of the board's long table, appeared outwardly composed. His binders were arranged neatly, pens aligned with precise care, and his laptop balanced in front of him as though he were preparing for a routine presentation. But subtle cues betrayed his inner turmoil: tightened jaw muscles, the way his foot tapped softly beneath the table, the stiffness in his posture as he scanned the audience. He was accustomed to being unchallenged, to presenting numbers that few questioned and fewer truly understood. Tonight would not grant him that luxury. As the meeting began, the board moved through the initial agenda items with strained normalcy. Routine votes were cast, reports delivered, and committee updates offered. Yet beneath every procedural motion lingered the awareness that the real discussion had yet to start. People shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward the group of homeowners who had quietly organized the investigation. The retired auditor sat among them with a binder heavy enough to suggest not just concern but certainty. When the time came for open financial review, the atmosphere shifted with almost physical force. One of the homeowners stood, stepping into the aisle with a stack of neatly tabbed documents. No dialogue passed, but the treasurer's eyes narrowed as he realized the moment of confrontation had arrived. The homeowner placed the stack onto the table before the board, the papers making a weighty sound that seemed to echo louder than expected. The board members leaned forward instinctively, drawn in by the gravity of the material laid before them. Charts, spreadsheets, scanned checks, timelines, vendor lists, discrepancy logs, every page meticulously organized. The retired auditor's influence was unmistakable in the clarity and format of the documentation. Only facts. Only numbers. Only truth. What followed was not a loud spectacle. But something far more damaging, a silent parade of evidence line by line. The homeowners presented their findings through written summaries, visual aids, and detailed financial trails. They noted checks issued to non-existent vendors. They highlighted transactions structured just below audit thresholds. They pointed out reimbursements lacking receipts and transfers routed through obscure accounts that bore no connection to HOA business. Each sheet of paper revealed another inconsistency, another piece of the puzzle that turned suspicion into certainty. As the board reviewed the documents, the treasurer's expression hardened. His shoulders tensed, and his hands tightened around the arms of his chair. He maintained his posture, attempting to exude calm authority, but small betrayals, rapid blinking, shallow breaths, the slightest tremor in his fingers exposed the panic he tried to conceal. The board members were no longer passive recipients of his reports. They whispered among themselves, compared notes, and scrutinized the treasurer with a new wariness. Their eyes, once trusting, now carried the weight of betrayal. The trust once extended so freely now felt like a naive mistake. As the audit findings continued, the treasurer's defenses crumbled in stages. His earlier composure eroded into visible agitation. But with no dialogue in this narration, his desperation was conveyed through restless movements, flipping through his own papers too quickly, checking numbers with unnecessary urgency, tapping his pen like a metronome of anxiety. His behavior conveyed what no spoken rebuttal could hide. He had not expected to be caught, and certainly not with such thorough evidence. The homeowners had anticipated every angle. They had copies of bank statements, digital logs, and archived meeting minutes. They had overlaid the treasurer's self-reported numbers with independent records, ensuring no gap could be explained away as simple error. Their evidence formed a mosaic too complete, too precise, to dismiss. One board member, long known for his patience, flipped through the binder slowly and stopped on a page marked with red annotations. His eyes scanned down a list of payments, small amounts, repeated monthly, each listed under vague operational expenses. The totals added up to thousands. Another member examined a series of checks made out to an LLC registered in a neighboring county, cross-referencing them with state business records. The entity existed, but the registration traced back to a residential address with no known relation to HOA maintenance or community contracts. A murmur of shock rippled through the board table. Though no words were spoken aloud in this narration, their gestures spoke volumes. Pens dropped. Notebooks closed. One board member leaned back, hand pressed against her forehead as if processing a blow. The realization dawned on them collectively. This was not incompetence. It was embezzlement. The treasurer's facade cracked further. He shuffled papers with increasing urgency, scanning for some explanation buried beneath the layers. But the truth was no longer something he could control. Every number he had manipulated, every record he had tried to obscure, every payment he had quietly redirected, it was all laid bare before him, undeniable and damning. As the board absorbed the full extent of the findings, the mood in the room thickened. Neighbors exchanged glances filled with anger, disbelief, and the grim satisfaction that accompanies long-delayed justice. The treasurer, once a figure of community trust, now sat isolated both physically and morally at the head of the table. The board chair finally gathered the documents into a single stack, holding them with a kind of reverence reserved for truths long buried. The atmosphere shifted once more, this time with a sense of inevitability. The next steps were obvious: a formal internal audit, legal consultation, and the immediate suspension of the treasurer's authority pending further investigation. The treasurer's body stiffened. His expression turned hollow, as if the weight of the discovery pressed down on him from all sides. He seemed to shrink in his seat, diminished by the truth he could no longer hide behind spreadsheets and polite presentations. The community had uncovered the ledger of lies. And the consequences would reach far beyond embarrassment. By the time the meeting adjourned, the narrative of the neighborhood had changed irrevocably. The treasurer had gone from trusted leader to prime suspect, and the homeowners left carrying a mixture of vindication and dread for what the next steps would uncover. The evidence presented tonight was only the beginning. Buried beneath the numbers were secrets waiting to be revealed, hidden accounts, false vendors, and perhaps even accomplices. The real unraveling had just begun. The days following the explosive HOA meeting carried a tension that lingered over the neighborhood like humidity after a storm, thick, heavy, impossible to ignore. Word spread quickly, even among those who hadn't attended the gathering. You could sense the shift in the way people walked their dogs, the way they lingered by their mailboxes, the way front porch conversations lasted longer than usual. The neighborhood, once lulled into suburban complacency, was now alive with whispered theories and speculations. Everyone sensed that the discovery at the meeting had only scratched the surface. The board convened privately for an emergency session, their mood somber and their task monumental. The treasurer had been officially suspended pending investigation, his access to accounts revoked immediately. They knew the homeowners' findings demanded real consequences, not just administrative hand-wringing. This wasn't an issue of sloppy bookkeeping. It was a potential crime involving community funds. But before they could involve law enforcement or legal counsel, they needed clarity, undeniable evidence, a full accounting of the theft, and the scope of the treasurer's scheme. The retired auditor, now effectively acting as the leader of the investigation, returned to her home the night of the meeting and spread documents across her kitchen table. Hours passed as she sifted through every line of the ledgers. Floodlights from her backyard cast long shadows across her walls while she filled page after page with notes. She didn't operate with anger or personal vengeance. Instead, she carried the burden of duty. She had witnessed at her former job how financial misconduct grew in darkness, buried under complacency. She would not allow that to happen here. What she found next would deepen the scandal more than anyone anticipated. She began mapping the Treasurers Association's address histories, business filings, and vendor connections. On her computer screen, patterns emerged with startling clarity. Several of the questionable vendors the HOA had been paying were tied to the same handful of addresses. Some listed UPS store mailboxes as business locations. Others were registered under obscure LLC names that had been created within months of the treasurer assuming office years ago. Each entity had collected HOA payments regularly, yet none provided tangible services anyone could recall. One LLC in particular caught her attention. Its name was generic, something about property maintenance, but no one had ever seen their workers or trucks. Its address listed a residential home 2 towns over. When she zoomed in on the street view image, her breath caught. The car parked in the driveway, a distinctive older model sedan, matched the one the treasurer drove to every HOA meeting. The implications were immediate and alarming. The treasurer had been paying himself through a fabricated vendor. She assembled all this into a meticulous report, complete with screenshots, timelines, and financial breakdowns. Each discovery fit like a piece of a puzzle, now forming a clear picture of deception. The total amount siphoned over the years wasn't just a few thousand, it approached tens of thousands. Meanwhile, the broader neighborhood braced itself. Some residents felt a sense of vindication. Others were horrified at how long the scheme had gone unnoticed. Many questioned how deeply the treasurer's influence had woven into the community's daily operations. The treasurer's presence had been deceptively benign, waving to joggers, volunteering at holiday events, offering to help older neighbors move their trash bins. That friendliness had masked the quiet precision with which he drained funds from their shared accounts. As the homeowners continued to investigate, they found another vein of concerning information. A secondary account, one not listed in official HOA documents, had been opened years earlier under the HOA's name but bore the treasurer's personal email as its primary contact. This account had received periodic deposits that matched the administrative fees appearing mysteriously on homeowner statements. The money had been funneled from the main HOA account into this unauthorized one before disappearing in a series of ATM withdrawals scattered across different towns. The homeowners cross-referenced surveillance logs from the bank ATMs, discovering timestamps that consistently matched the treasurer's known schedule. Even without dialogue, the data painted a damning narrative. He had built an entire infrastructure for theft, weaving his schemes through the fabric of the HOA's finances like a parasite disguised among its host. The board, reviewing this information with grim faces, realized the situation now set well beyond the scope of their authority. What they were staring at was no longer a simple matter of HOA mismanagement. It had become criminal fraud, and their next step required professional intervention. Before contacting the authorities, they agreed to take one final step: a comprehensive forensic audit. They hired a certified external auditor, an impartial expert who could examine every scrap of financial data with a legal lens. The auditor worked discreetly, arriving early in the mornings with a briefcase full of tools and leaving late at night with a laptop full of spreadsheets. 4 days he combed through financial records, bank statements, and vendor contracts. His silence during the process was unnerving but necessary. When his audit report arrived, it confirmed everything and more. The treasurer hadn't acted recklessly but strategically. He had exploited loopholes in oversight, manipulated vendor lists, forged a few signatures, and relied on the board's trust to oversee transactions without question. The report included evidence of falsified invoices, duplicate payments, and even a few forged reimbursement receipts, complete with handwriting analysis tying them back to the treasurer. The magnitude of the theft now came into sharp focus. Over several years, he had stolen nearly $87,000 in community funds. The board sat in disbelief as they absorbed the findings. This amount wasn't just a blow to the budget, it was a catastrophe. This money was meant for roof repairs, insurance deductibles, emergency maintenance, road resurfacing, and seasonal improvements. Instead, it had been siphoned into someone's pockets. With the forensic audit completed, the homeowners prepared for the next step. They gathered every piece of evidence, every ledger entry, every check copy, every vendor analysis, and arranged them in a binder that had grown thick with pages. The case they had built was undeniable, thorough, and ready for legal scrutiny. The treasurer, unaware of how much had been uncovered, remained inside his home most days now. Neighbors noticed that he avoided eye contact when collecting his mail. His once confident posture diminished. His porch lights remained off at night. His driveway stayed empty for hours longer than usual in the mornings. The man who once moved with comfort through the neighborhood now seemed haunted by its gaze. The board scheduled a closed-door meeting for the following week. This meeting would decide the treasurer's fate and the community's next course of action. The homeowners involved in the investigation felt both anxious and resolute. They had not sought power or control, they had sought truth, accountability, and the preservation of their neighborhood's integrity. The evidence had been gathered. The deception exposed. The trail mapped from beginning to end. All that remained now was justice and the storm that would surely come with it. The night before the closed-door HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt eerily silent, as though holding its breath. Porch lights flickered on early, dogs barked at nothing in particular, and the wind rustled across yards in a way that carried tension instead of calm. Everyone knew the board was preparing to confront the treasurer with the evidence, an incontrovertible body of proof that would shatter everything he'd built his reputation upon. This wasn't just about stolen money anymore. It was about betrayal so deep it rewrote the fabric of trust that held the community together. The treasurer's home, usually well-lit and inviting, appeared dark and shuttered. Curtains remained closed even during the day. A growing unease hung around the property, an imbalance created when a person accustomed to controlling his narrative sensed that control slipping through his fingers. He had always been meticulous, organized, and composed, but in the days since the audit, his behavior had frayed like old rope. He lingered inside, pacing behind blinds, carrying the anxiety of someone who knew the truth was coming for him faster than he could hide. When the evening of the meeting arrived, the board gathered in the small HOA office above the gym. The room was stark and fluorescent, the kind of environment where truth felt sharper and more inescapable. Folders stacked neatly on the table contained everything: vendor breakdowns, bank statements, forged signatures, fake LLC ties, ATM timestamps, and the forensic auditor's damning report. There was no angle left unexplored, no plausible misunderstanding left to cling to. The treasurer arrived late, disheveled, unshaven, and visibly resigned. He stepped inside the meeting room with slow, heavy movements. His usual air of controlled authority had evaporated. Instead, he resembled someone who had spent the last few nights wrestling with the reality that denial was no longer a shield strong enough to protect him. The board members watched him with a mixture of disappointment and quiet fury. They were not people accustomed to confrontation or scandal. They were volunteers, neighbors who simply wanted their community to run smoothly. Yet here they were, charged with the responsibility of dismantling a fraudulent scheme that had robbed them all. And the evidence binder slid across the table toward him. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, each page turning like a slow confession. Copies of checks made out to shell vendors. Account transfers to unauthorized banking profiles. Vendor addresses tied directly to properties he owned or controlled. The signature analysis proving he had forged reimbursements. The large, unforgiving number at the end of the audit, $87,000 stolen. He did not argue. He did not point fingers. He did not posture or plead. Instead, he flipped page after page in quiet surrender. Though no dialogue filled the room, his shifting posture told the entire story. His shoulders sagged further with each piece of evidence, until he appeared almost crushed by the weight of his own deception. The board members reviewed the final steps in their process. Their expressions were solemn and resolved. They had spent the days prior consulting legal counsel, analyzing their bylaws, and preparing for the ramifications. They knew that ignoring a crime of this magnitude would be negligent. They knew they had a duty to the homeowners who trusted them to protect the community's welfare. When the decision was made, it was unanimous and swift. They formally removed the treasurer from his position. They barred him from accessing any HOA accounts or documents. And they approved a full criminal complaint, supported by every piece of evidence meticulously gathered. The treasurer's expression twisted in the painful realization that the consequences had moved beyond neighborhood politics. This was now a matter of law, of restitution, and of a stain that would follow him long after he left the doors of that meeting. When he exited, he did so quietly, shuffling down the dimly lit staircase like a man walking away from the remains of a facade he had built over years. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and blinds as he returned home, shoulders slumped, steps uneven. His garage door opened and closed with a metallic groan, one that resonated throughout the cul-de-sac like a closing chapter. The following morning, patrol cars arrived, their presence transformed the uneasy hush into murmuring shock. Officers approached the treasurer's doorway with calm professionalism, their uniforms stark against the backdrop of manicured lawns. The knock on his door echoed down the street. When he appeared, he seemed resigned, eyes hollow, expression defeated. Although he offered no resistance, the sight of handcuffs clasping around his wrists sent ripples through the neighborhood. It was the kind of moment residents would remember vividly for years. A man many had welcomed into their homes, who had waved sweetly at their kids and offered to help with holiday setup, now being escorted into a police car for embezzling the very funds he had been trusted to manage. The car pulled away slowly, leaving behind an unsettling mix of relief and disbelief. What followed was a long period of rebuilding. The HOA, humbled and chastened, implemented new transparency procedures, quarterly independent audits, dual signature requirements, vendor verification systems, and detailed receipts for every transaction. The retired auditor became a temporary consultant, helping them sew up financial vulnerabilities and educate the board on red flags to watch for. As these changes took shape, the neighborhood gradually exhaled the tension that had held it captive. The community pool received overdue repairs. Landscaping debts were paid. Seasonal decorations returned with proper funding. Meetings grew calmer again, filled with planning rather than accusation. Even the social atmosphere revived. Neighbors chatted more openly, sharing a sense of unity forged through adversity. Households that had once drifted apart now found common ground in protecting their community. The experience had carved out a fierce new pride, a determination never to allow complacency to blind them again. Meanwhile, the treasurer's legal case moved steadily forward. The evidence was overwhelming. He ultimately faced multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Court proceedings revealed how systematically he had siphoned funds, and his conviction brought closure to those who had once trusted him. Restitution was ordered. Though it would take years, the community would eventually recover most of the stolen funds. As time passed, the neighborhood did more than heal. It strengthened. The scandal became the story that would be retold in lowered voices at block parties and HOA training sessions for years to come. Parents reminded children that trust must be paired with caution. Homeowners remembered to read financial reports instead of assuming all was well. The HOA treasurer had stolen money. But in trying to deceive everyone, he inadvertently taught the community how powerful they could be when united. When the dust settled, the neighborhood reclaimed what was theirs, not just the funds, but the sense of integrity and vigilance they had lost without realizing it. Justice had taken him down, but teamwork had lifted the community back up.